Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll probably have a few others come in. Thank you for joining us for today's briefing on the impact of wildfires and natural disasters on women and girls. I'm Yasmin Vafa. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls. We are a national human rights organization based here in Washington, D.C., and we work to end gender-based violence against young women and girls in the United States. We're so grateful to have you with us for what promises to be an important conversation on a growing concern for this country and so many others throughout the globe as weather patterns and climate change fuel more frequent and deadlier disasters for many communities across the world. Here in the United States, whether it's hurricanes, tropical storms, tornadoes, or the subject of today's briefing, wildfires, natural disasters threaten communities in so many different ways. First, by taking the lives and damaging infrastructures and homes, destroying community well-being and support structures, and then by fueling further harm, including domestic violence, child abuse, and even sexual exploitation. At Rights for Girls, we work to end gender violence against young women and girls across a variety of systems and spaces, including child welfare, criminal and youth justice, in schools, and in the community at large. We know firsthand that when policies are designed without an explicit gender lens, women and girls always get left behind. For example, we've watched for years as states and jurisdictions pass sweeping juvenile justice reform policies, yet we're baffled as to why women and girls failed to benefit from these resulting outcomes. We published reports and briefings detailing this same phenomenon, urging that we must take a holistic lens to policy decisions or risk leaving large groups and communities behind in any plans or progress that is made. Today's panelists have taken the extraordinary step in documenting the comprehensive impact of a wildfire in the U.S. in this first of its kind report, Equality in Flames. The authors looked holistically at the different effects of the wildfire disaster on all genders, including men, and detailed the outcomes. Critically, the report contains a blueprint that offers not just lessons learned from Lahaina, but recommendations for what other jurisdictions can do to safeguard women and girls and other vulnerable populations in the wake of future natural disasters in other states prone to such tragedies. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, Nadine Ortega, who is the executive director of Tagnawa, the only women's rights-centered disaster response, recovery, and rebuilding organization in Hawaii. Nadine has been selected to be one of GRIST's 50 climate leaders to watch for 2025. And Cara Jabola Carolis, who is co-founder of the Ulana Institute and co-author of Equality in Flames. Cara was named as Apolitical's 100 most influential leaders in gender policy globally and locally as one of 20 for the next 20 leaders by Hawaii Business Magazine. We'll also be joined by Congresswoman Takuda, who's actually here. It is my honor to introduce Congresswoman Takuda, who represents Hawaii, to deliver some remarks. Thank you so much for joining us, Congresswoman.
Aloha, everyone. Oh, that's sad. Come on. You can do better. Aloha. Okay, there we go. Now we're off to a great start right now. I just want to, first of all, mahalo all of you for being here for this very important presentation, to Yasmin, to Nadine, Cara, for bringing us all together for this important conversation, and quite frankly, the work that we need to do to follow this. And to each, as I said, of you for showing up. For those of you that are here that have been putting in the hard work of truth telling and change making, this is something our community needs so much right now. You know, when I read Equality in Flames, for me, it's so much more than a report. And I'm sure it is so much more to all of you too. It shows us what our immigrant and indigenous communities have known for generations. That even well before the fires, they were already living through disasters. Disasters of poverty, of language barriers, and caregiving burdens that too often fell on women, on girls, The fires of Lahaina didn't just destroy homes and landscapes. They exposed to me and, showed us the very deepened inequality we already knew, quite frankly, was there. And now those cracks, quite frankly, have only widened even more. Families struggling to find affordable housing are displaced even further. Women who are already carrying the load of caregiving now shoulder even more burden with even less resources. And survivors who didn't speak English still fight to be seen, to be heard, and to be helped. This is where humanity and humility demands honesty as well. Knowing that what we know now, from the pages of the report, from the information and the data collected from survivors, what we know now, we cannot look away. We each have, Kuleana, a responsibility to make sure that we don't rebuild the same broken system and just call it recovery. And just say we provided the help. True recovery means at the core of it dignity. It means safety. It means equity. It means building disaster response systems that are culturally and linguistically competent. Systems that don't treat women and girls as an afterthought, but at the heart of our communities as we know we are. The recommendations in this report are not abstract. They are a roadmap. Quite frankly, center community leadership, deliver culturally competent services, prioritize justice and lived experience in every decision we make. But we have a choice right now in front of us. We can repeat the patterns of neglect like we often do post-disaster, post-trauma, post-event, or we can rise to the occasion and rise to this moment. And we can do right by the women and the girls who have carried us through. So, as you listen to the report, as you listen to the words, as you hear the results of the data that they collected, the recommendations that they will make, let's all commit here in all of our individual capacities from the different offices you come from the work you do on and off the Hill. Let's commit not to just dialogue and gather together, but to actually act. To not just acknowledge pain, but to reshape the systems that we know caused that very pain. Because the measure of recovery will not be the number of buildings rebuilt. It will be the safety and the dignity we secure for every single survivor, and that should be the mission. So mahalo to Rights for Girls, Tagnawa for your leadership, mahalo to each and every single one of you for taking time to be present in this moment and to committing to further action from here. And I'm humbled to stand side by side as we go along and we fight to make sure that survivors get absolutely 100% what they need. Thank you again, and mahalo again for being here. Thank you. These guys are amazing. So I do very good. Thank you so much. I'll just like, oh yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for your powerful words, your support. We're grateful for your leadership. And with that, I'm privileged to turn it over to our authors on this report to share some of their key findings and recommendations before we open it up to questions from the audience. So take it away, ladies.
Hi, everyone. Aloha kako. Thank you to Rights for Girls, and Yasmin, for hosting this congressional briefing. And thank you to Congresswoman Jill Takuda and her staff. And thank you everyone for coming and hearing this report. We are presenting today this report, the first of its kind that documents how disasters like wildfires disproportionately affect women and girls, especially immigrants, Indigenous women. And I'm excited to share with you this report. So Tagnawa, my organization, was founded in August 2023 in response to the Lahaina fires. My family are survivors. I have friends and students who are survivors. Their homes were destroyed by the fires. They asked for our help. So we mobilized a group of volunteers from Oahu and Maui to help. Even state agencies didn't have their system in place and asked us for help. That's how Tagnawa started. We began as a resource navigation, translating and interpreting for survivors in multiple Philippine languages. 500 Filipinos were waiting for us that first day to help with filling out applications, food money, someone to fight for them. In about 2 years, Tagnawa has grown into Hawaii's only women's rights-centered recovery and preparedness organization, a disaster research clearinghouse, and an immigrant women's organizing center and a gender equity watchdog. Our mission is to redesign disaster preparedness, response, and recovery so that they explicitly and equally address the needs of marginalized women and girls. We are here to strengthen relationships between Filipinos, communities in multiple lands. Now, why did we do this report? None of the multi-billion-dollar organizations in the Lahaina recovery conducted forensics of the response rooted in the lived experiences of women, immigrants, and families that were most affected. FEMA's own advisory council admitted in 2024 that victims and those at high risk of gender-based violence were left out of disaster planning. They acknowledged the gap that FEMA needs to review its own rules and policies to ensure gender-based violence mitigation is not just written on paper, but actually effectively implemented on the ground. Now, other countries, including the Philippines, where I was born, already designed disaster preparedness, relief, and recovery to address specific vulnerabilities. They recognize what we know to be true, that disasters are not gender neutral and recovery cannot be a one-size-fits-all model. When it comes to wildfire disasters in the US and gender-based violence, there's virtually no data, especially on commercial sexual exploitation. There is some data, however, from water-based disasters, but not US wildfires. That is why Tagnawa stepped in. We became the first organization to successfully advocate for inclusion of gender-based violence questions into needs assessments after the fires. It ensured for the first time the experiences of women and immigrant survivors would not be erased from the data or policy response. The impetus of our study was simple and urgent: to hold recovery systems accountable, to center survivors, and to produce evidence that can no longer be ignored. So our goals with this report was threefold. First, to introduce gender integration into disaster frameworks in Hawaii. Second, to conduct a gender forensic analysis of the Lahaina fire response through the eyes of women that we can also use as a blueprint for other contexts. And third, to advocate for solutions proposed by women themselves. We believe that data without action is injustice, and we are working to shift local, state, and federal response systems so that women are no longer overlooked or harmed by design. And these were how our recommendations were formulated. We had early consultation with scholars in Australia with expertise on bushfire and gender. We had information requests to the Hawaii Department of Human Services, the Department of the Prosecuting Attorney for Maui County, and the Maui Police Department, which if you look on our website, www.tagnawa.org, you can access the full report. It's 50+ pages. We also had confidential surveys of adult female Filipino fire survivors on Maui in English and Philippine languages. And this was led by our Maui full-time organizer, Cheryl, who is also a fire survivor herself. We also conducted key informant interviews with Maui-based specialists in mental health, reproductive health care, criminal justice, and gender-based violence. And we requested FEMA participation. And I'll pass this on to Kara to talk more about the specific findings.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Kara, and I'm gonna get into the nitty-gritty of the report, but a little bit about the profile of Lahaina. So why Filipinos, why immigrants, why Indigenous people, and why vulnerable genders? So just as a recap, 12,000 people have been displaced. So we know that wildfires are mass homelessness causing events. And these produce long-term conditions of homelessness for thousands of people. 2,000 homes have been destroyed, and at the time that I made this slide, less than 0.5% of those homes had been rebuilt. So we're about 2 years, we're just over 2 years after the fire. Illustrative of this, homelessness across the entire state of Hawaii rose by 87%, and that is where it has remained. Also, a very grim statistic, 102 confirmed fatalities. As compared, not comparing the tragedy of this, of course, but just numerically to the 31 deaths in the recent Los Angeles fires. So this small community in Lahaina was really interconnected, and the losses have been very personal across the community. Also, it's a very different place from the rest of Maui and the rest of the state. So has double the percentage of immigrants. So this is really a case study of what can happen to a community that has a high immigrant population, a significant indigenous population. Over 10% of the Lahaina community was Native Hawaiian. So majority people of color, majority immigrants, and again, substantial indigenous population. Also in Hawaii, we view gender differently. So in our Pacific cultures and in Hawaiian culture, we recognize more than 2 genders. We also have a very different history when it comes to women's rights and how women have found their status today. So incorporating gender is something that was just really a no-brainer for us. And I also my background was in government, and compared to the private sector, we don't do very good at consumer feedback. And so I felt that it was very important that we built the forensics of the response around the people who have been working on this day in and day out and who've experienced the brunt of the disaster. Also, majority of the population in Lahaina, the reason why it's so Filipino and so Native Hawaiian is this is the working class that was brought here or maintained here by the sugar plantation that was in that area. And when the sugar plantation closed and pivoted to resort development, the same company, they simply hired out of the plantation. So that is why the demographics are the way that they are, and it's a high working class, high renter population. And also starkly, when you think of Hawaii, you probably think of a lush destination, paradise, but in truth, because of these particular industries, water has been thefted, it's been mismanaged, and it's been overused. And so every year, approximately 0.5% of Hawaii's total land area burns. So I live in a very drought heavy, arid, I actually see tumbleweeds go across my neighborhood, which is not the image that most people would think of in Hawaii. But we know that wildfires, of course, the LA fire illustrated this, are intensifying in frequency and in scale of destruction. And so this really, truly, I believe, is a blueprint for the nation. We wanted to offer, and our intent with making this report was not just to focus on Lahaina, but to present solutions so that you all know what to do for the next emergency to prevent the findings that we unearthed. And the first thing I think that is helpful if you're looking at this report is that it's not just about women. So we looked at this from a feminist perspective, which means we looked at gender holistically. So how did this affect people of different genders? Who's doing the work in the recovery? How's the division of labor playing out? How is mental health playing out among different genders? And it's all extremely different because of the way that we're socialized and raised and educated. And so the findings do not just apply to women, and they don't just apply to Filipino women. So we had a case study. The de-identified anonymous survey is specific to Filipino women. But most of the data applies generally. Also, like Yasmin was saying, we know internationally that there's a connection between wildfires and trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation. But this is the first report to look at wildfires and see if there's any linkages between those issues domestically. It was actually really surprising to me because globally and internationally, gender analysis has been very mainstreamed into disaster. But this is actually a very nascent space in the US. So if you're, a Congress member, or if you as a policy advocate are working on, let's say, criminal justice you now have this new, right, factor. It's a really important on-ramp also into working on issues of gender violence if you're working on disasters. So as Nadine mentioned, FEMA has recognized the need for change in 2024, had a subcommittee that came up with recommendations. Some of those recommendations were emphasized by what we found and overlap our recommendations, and some of our recommendations expand upon and narrow FEMA's recommendations. So we'll get to those in a second. Also very important, this is not just about a tragedy findings, but also the solutions that people who've been trying to navigate the last 2 years have proposed to us. So it's very much about how can we make this less likely to happen in the event of the next fire. So just some recaps of some of the findings. So when we consulted with Australia, which unfortunately is very ahead of the curve when it comes to studying gender and bushfires, they explained to us and asked us to look out for certain things because wildfires are actually different from water-based disasters and all other environmental disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes. Wildfires are the only disaster where men die at higher numbers than women. And this has to do with perceptions of masculinity, that there's this unfortunately delusional belief that men, because firefighting is so masculine, can actually control the fire. And so men are staying behind more, and then they're being rewarded in media for staying behind as heroes. When in other disasters, like Laura was saying, they're often criticized for jeopardizing other people's lives. It's kind of the reverse in a fire setting. So even when it comes to who dies and who lives, actually comes back to gender. We also looked at women's health and gender health indicators and found a lot of gaps that were actually very shocking. Like, for example, menstrual equity products, baby formula, those things were not repositioned at shelter sites. So those were not universally accessible. Also, many of the structures that FEMA and the American Red Cross have pursued for years that seem facially just neutral are actually extremely male-centered and patriarchal. So for example, I have it on the, I'll get to it. But for example, FEMA does weekly check-ins with each family, but you have to designate a head of household. And in Lahaina, the majority of heads of household were defaulting to men. And so this was something that was raised to us repeatedly by domestic violence service providers, is that there was no opportunity for people of other genders to equally report or share what they were going through. And it was always just so the men were speaking for the whole family situation. So that's just one example of many of how being neutral is actually not neutral. It's just continuing historical biases. Another really surprising finding is because of the disruption, certain violences get exposed. And so there's been a heightened reporting of child sexual abuse and elder sexual abuse. Another thing is that reporting has come from bystanders who aren't necessarily familiar with what to do in that situation. On the flip side, we've seen what we're terming as post-disaster silence. So new incentives, not that we need it anymore, but to delay reporting things that happen to us or never report them at all. Because perpetrator is now tied to disaster resources. And so you don't want to jeopardize your relationship with your abuser because you need housing and housing comes first, for example. One of the most shocking findings, according to one of the mental health professionals we interviewed, was mothers, pattern she's observed of mothers minimizing and downplaying child sexual abuse of their children because of the desperate need for resources attached to the perpetrator. Also, domestic violence tripled. We know that after the Lahaina fire in terms of help seeking, it could be higher, but in terms of help seeking and the sexual violence component of those cases. And we also found, and this had never been documented, that Maui Sexual Assault Center also experienced an increase of help seeking after the fire. And of course, this made the headlines because unfortunately, the report is novel in terms of finding documentation and substantiating what many have feared, which is a connection between sexual exploitation and a new massive vulnerable population. So in the survey of Filipino fire survivors, 16% disclosed that they had felt compelled to exchange sex acts for basic fire-related needs. And the most common reason was for food. This is unbelievable in the United States, right? The wealthiest nation on earth. The second most common reason was for clothes because they didn't have any clothes after the fire. And the only reason I think people were even comfortable reporting any of this is because it was led by a survivor, Cheryl, who Nidhi mentioned, and using a community member who was going through the same experience. Majority of the participants were also skewed more elderly. So the fact that 16% of a population that's not usually in that target exploitation age range discloses really is, to me, as someone who's worked on trafficking for a long time, an indicator of potentially a much wider problem. And we also know, right, too, our homeless youth, our LGBTQ youth in Hawaii are in particular vulnerability to sexual exploitation. So these are all things that warrant, not just more research, but further action. And we know this, right? We know this internationally. The State Department does, of course, the report every year. And in the Philippines, I pulled a quote. We've seen this elsewhere that acknowledges natural disasters and climate change induced displacement. Yeah, this is coming from the Department of State. Increases Filipinos' vulnerability to trafficking due to the loss of, livelihood, shelter, etc. And the vulnerabilities are made more acute by gender inequalities enshrined in government responses. So why has this not yet been mainstreamed in our own homeland, right? Also, after the LA fires, this was earlier this year, the LA County Consumer and Business Affairs put up this website, this page of resources because they were concerned about human trafficking. So it's a resource list of kind of how to spot trafficking and who to call. But they didn't have any data yet, right? So our report really confirms that they should have been concerned, and this is an important step to take. And again, it's very structural. So agencies and what they're mandated to do or not mandated yet to do can absolutely make this preventable. So none of what we found is inevitable, and I really want to emphasize that. So here are some of the key federal recommendations. I encourage you to use the report as a reference if you want to look at that. It's extensive, and the full report has more of the FEMA recommendations too. Again, some of these are consistent with their own findings, and others actually find the little pieces that you wouldn't get from if you were coming from just like an office in DC and not talking to the survivors. But frequent relocation, particularly of people of color and immigrant survivors, disproportionately relative to more privileged survivors, is something that service providers believe is increased vulnerability, violence, anger, frustration. The constant turnover of staff every 2 weeks built into the policies of the Red Cross and FEMA do not create the conditions for people to feel comfortable to report. They create conditions for re-traumatization. The check-in procedures, applications, multiple folks who we interviewed who talked about, who came from the kind of resource navigation roles in the recovery, said that they had yet never seen one application that asked, what's going on in the home? Not one application question asked, are you safe? Are you experiencing gender-based violence? What are the dynamics like? So there are more proactive interventions than even simply just training staff to spot gender-based violence. You can actually screen for these in the questioning, right? We cannot sit back and expect people to report gender-based violence. We already know that before disasters. Mandating coordination is also really important. So FEMA did contact people. For example, one service provider said she was like at the grocery store and was talking to another head of another domestic violence organization. Was like, oh, FEMA called you too. So FEMA was contacting, but there was just a lack of state coordination, a lack of federal coordination on gender issues at all. And then also more cultural and gender sensitivity training certainly benefit the recovery. And one of the biggest, most distinct ways and recommendations that we found was the recommendation to treat wildfires similar to a mass shooting event, where you have crisis counseling, gender violence counseling, sort of a triage and a gender-based violence or gender issue fighting headquarters all together. So that came up also. And finally, here's some of the things that we've been doing in Hawaii before we turn over to questions and I wrap up. But we've socialized the report to some of the folks in the environmental space who are principals of organizations nationally when we were in Puerto Rico earlier this year. We've also been doing housing advocacy because homelessness is a systemic issue that predated the report. And so Lahaina won a major victory because of kind of the post-disaster unity that was created and the incredible organizing where short-term rentals were returned back to the housing market for fire survivors, which is a process that's still ongoing. And then we were able to pass a state safe harbor law for victims and survivors of commercial sexual exploitation, where they will not be criminalized for seeking help. And then finally, working at our state level to think of some policy solutions and then county level. So we have kind of all the levels, but federal action remains to be seen. And I think that having discussed with Rights for Girls over the last couple of meetings, it would be purposeful to have perhaps a standalone bill to raise visibility around the intersection of gender and fires or gender and environmental disasters. Also, there's just a lack of champions talking about gender and wildfires. That is a wide open lane that we really need to begin to address. So I am going to turn it back over to Yasmin, but thank you so much for attending and happy to answer questions.
Thank you both so much for all of that really helpful and powerful data and research. I'm going to open it up to the audience and see if we have any questions. We also have some people I know on the Zoom, but let us know if you have any questions from the report. Anyone in the audience? Otherwise, I have lots of questions. Yes.
So who did you guys pick out? How anything specifically on the experience of care workers?
So the question was if they had found out anything specifically on the experience of care workers.
Okay. Yes, we did.
Go ahead.
So Hawaii has the highest per capita, highest rate of intergenerational homes. So care work is also done informally. And what happened is because of FEMA structures and that had to be taught to FEMA and they had to actively adapt and reform their system of keeping family homes together. So that was a major reform that occurred in the process because what's happened is that caregiving of elder relatives is logistically extremely difficult now. So families have been separated into different temporary housing, and this is still 2 years after, where women, the quote from the report from one of the caregivers was that women are like the marathon runners of recovery, where they're still doing the majority of care work, and they're also doing the things that are considered women's work. They're doing the applications, they're doing the translations, they're doing like the busy work, the logistics that men, after they were seen and recorded and heralded for like delivering aid, like that has kind of faded out.
And I just want to add that, displacement really messed up the the network and connections that were already in place because of the multi-generational household. Now, because of the splitting up of households, some of that care work fell on women, and they had to drive to another separate area in Maui to take care of their elderly relatives. Some of them have told us, and you can see this in our first report about Filipino women, that now they have to quit their jobs because they have to keep driving around, to watch their elderly mother or father and then drop the kids off. And there's like a whole trauma involved with that as well. So there's support systems that were there specifically with the multi-generational household, but because of FEMA and some of the policies of separating some of the households, it disrupted that.
Other questions? Yes.
Can you talk about any unique impacts on immigrant communities, sort of particular challenges that they may be facing or had faced in the recovery?
So the question was, if they could talk about any of the unique challenges faced by the immigrant community, and talk about some of their specific challenges.
Okay. There's a lot because Lahaina is very heavy immigrant population. There's also very high levels of Filipinos, also high in undocumented immigrants. Everything, it has impacted them in really, really severe ways. Everything from like access to services and recovery and help. Language barriers is huge and still is to this day. Now that the CDBGDR funds have been rolled out, and there's 3 housing programs that are now currently being launched, and even survivors themselves cannot access some of these things, cannot apply because of language barriers, and a lot of them are giving up, and they're telling us on the ground that they're being re-traumatized all over again. Even our survivor herself, she's giving up, and I really feel for her. So language barriers, even like fear of trying to get help because they might be deported or criminalized. So
that FEMA that was there, they had ice on their shark.
So, yeah, one of the first things that we observed, this was days after the fire, was in the congregate shelter areas. The FEMA workers were wearing Department of Homeland Security jackets. And that had a very chilling effect, and it did not go unnoticed, obviously. Another significant challenge is also just in understanding, like FEMA was not doing town halls, kind of explaining, here's the forms that are mandatory. Here's what you can actually challenge, like this relocation. So immigrants were not pushing back against anything. So you'll have an immigrant family that's maybe relocated 20 times versus someone who's an American citizen who's like, wait, do I have to? And petitioning their relocation. And that was across the board.
And a lot of the notices to relocate were all in English. And now, immediately after the fires, these displacements, the relocations were happening multiple times. So we have people who are moving 5 to 7 times in the course of 2 months.
And also the immigrants too, because the immigrant survivors were often the hotel workers, and there was this push to reopen tourism. And there was not the sufficient economic support initially, that they were working in their shelters. So they were being sheltered in the hotels where they were serving tourists, and they were not allowed to use the same amenities as tourists, and they were not ready to go back to work. So they were crying on their shifts. I mean, it was just this dystopian situation.
And I want to add that FEMA workers that came from the continent to Hawaii were being housed in those hotels that Filipino workers, immigrant workers were working at, and they were the survivors, right? So you can see how
I mean, I think a lot, yeah, as Nadine said, there's a lot, but I think one thing too that really struck us, and it's an anecdote, was just the lack, it appeared that there was a lack of sufficient briefing on the demographics that they were serving. So there were multiple times when I would interface with a senior level, person from a certain agency, and they would say, oh, I had no idea there were Filipinos in Hawaii. I thought all the immigrants would be Mexican. Or thank God you're here because we have no idea how to deal with these Filipinos. Or, well, at least all Filipinos speak Spanish. I mean, there was there was not the sufficient training on here's the place that you're going to be serving and the uniqueness of the setting. So that's something that I think could be a really basic fix, but needs to be fixed across the board.
You mentioned that FEMA acknowledged this lack of information, incorporation in their disaster preparedness, and they put this committee together to come up with recommendations. Is there any indication now that FEMA is incorporating that in their disaster preparedness? And then I guess if not, is there room for states to kind of fill that gap in the way that they do that their disaster preparedness?
So the question was, you've indicated that FEMA's advisory committee initially did not incorporate any of these types of recommendations into their response. Is there any indication that they have subsequently done so, or that states in their disaster recovery response can fill this gap?
I don't have any information that they have implemented it, because it's pretty fresh as well, their recommendation. And it's, one of the recommendations was to assess if it's being effectively implemented. But I do think that there are some things that the states can do. For example, just get up, identify for a focal point coordinator who's going to coordinate the gender agencies in the state, the gender serving organizations. Perhaps allocating resources to crisis counseling and assigning them at FEMA sites. But there's also a lot, right, that FEMA does itself that's internal that we can't really affect. So, and is working with survivors much more directly and heavily and over a sustained period. So, there are some things, and maybe some of you have information about what FEMA's been doing the last couple of months, but I don't know if any.
I think it was really powerful, the quote from the TIP report, that showed that, the US government is aware that natural disasters fuel, violence, trafficking, and exploitation as a result, as a direct result of natural disasters, and they, fuel that type of vulnerability. So I think that's a really good way of, introducing the concept. So
And it's also, there's information with the CDC and NIH on this specific issue, but there's not like a clear coordination between agencies. So different agencies are seeing this as an issue.
there's a comment made that the CDC and NIH are also aware of the connections between this issue, but there doesn't seem to be cross-agency collaboration or communication with respect to the fact that this is a real issue. Yes.
I was wondering if folks had any data on how much the experiences of Filipino and Native Hawaiian women maybe overlap, or if not, and like any unique challenges that you found that Kanaka experience in navigating these processes.
So the question was whether there were any overlaps in terms of the experiences between the Filipino community and the indigenous community, the Native Hawaiian community, or if there were any unique challenges.
The fires, I don't want to say leveled the playing field, but it impacted the whole Lahaina community in its entirety, right? But the experiences are not the same. We have to understand that the Filipinos and Native Hawaiians were experiencing different things and also similar things of displacement, but we also have to recognize that Native Hawaiians are indigenous to Lahaina, indigenous to Hawaii, and there's an element of displacement that is a little different. You know, but the community did come together, I think, to fight for some policy changes together. So there was also a way when the community came together.
On gender issues, Native Hawaiians and Filipinos, face disproportionately high levels of gender-based violence, with Native Hawaiians most severely, Native Hawaiian women, and gender minorities most severely affected. And the communities that are, most fire at risk are the communities with the highest levels of domestic violence, which is a strange thing, right? So what's up with that? There are Native Hawaiian and Filipino communities that have been historically just repeatedly displaced with cycles of crisis and have less access to economic agency and resources. And so there are many parallels in terms of the high levels of violence there. And I say that as the former co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Native Hawaiian Women and Girls Task Force. But we did not study Native Hawaiians because we believe that, with our expertise, that each community deserves its own cultural methodology. And so that was an intentional choice. However, with the organizations that Nadine collaborates with, the feedback has been, we've been seeing the same exact thing. So people, did not say, oh, that's so wild that you found 1 in 6, when we've, spoken to the Latino immigrant community on Maui, and others. It's, you're just confirming what we've been seeing. So we hope that they can use the report as like a model to better understand specific communities. But yeah, that's where the situation is at in terms of the research.
And I want to add that I had a meeting with Maui-based organizations and Maui agencies in August. And Vero, one of the executive directors of one of the Maui-based organizations there, specifically helping Latinx folks in the recovery, she said, you can take this report and substitute everything that says like Filipino, and it would be it mirrors the exact experiences of Latinas in Maui during recovery. And I also spoke with the Maui medic Hui, who we partner with all the time. There's a whole like sweep of like houseless folks in Maui who are also survivors of the fires. Majority of that community are Filipinos and Kanaka, Native Hawaiians. And there's also high rates of violence against women for Kanaka and Filipinos in that community.
And it's worth noting, just, looking at issues of gender-based violence, sexual violence, and sex trafficking in Hawaii as a whole, and Indigenous women and girls are vastly overrepresented. Just looking at data, and I know, Kara, you've been involved in doing a lot of that research. I think over 75% of those who are trafficked in Hawaii are identified as part or fully Native Hawaiian. So already you're seeing high numbers of Indigenous women and girls who are represented in that population. So it wouldn't be surprising at all to find very similar rates of exploitation and gender violence here. Any other questions? We have about 5 more minutes. Yes.
So in your report, a lot of the recommendations were towards like FEMA and other federal agencies. Are there any solutions that could come from Congress, whether it be like through appropriations or some sort of legislation that could kind of make up for the agency's shortcomings?
So the question was whether there are any recommendations that could come from Congress that could make up for the federal agency's shortcomings.
One thing that we've discussed is exploring a GAO report just to, further build momentum and specific details around what that answer could look like more fully. And it should not be on the shoulders, right, of like a grassroots organization to do a forensics of organizations with billions of dollars. So that's one thing. I think that we strongly second the recommendations so far made out of FEMA, which is to mandate training, mandate crisis counseling, mandate the provision of reproductive health care resources at emergency shelters. So those are some of the things that I think are pretty low hanging fruit that you could message in different ways depending on a certain politics that could either come in from a disaster framework or from a gender justice framework or a climate framework. So, I mean,
Anything else?
and supporting rights for girls legislation, because this is, this has deep roots and is very systemic. So anything that you can do to combat commercial sexual exploitation, because, right, these fires are spreading nationally and climate disasters. And so this is an issue that will intersect with each and every one of those crises.
Yeah, and I think, one of the key takeaways from this briefing that we hope, it really comes, away from this issue is that taking a holistic lens to any one of these issues, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's, justice reform, as we mentioned in our remarks, whether it's, child welfare policy, whatever it is, we need to take a holistic lens, because one of the things that we've realized is that the failure to really consider all aspects of the community and an issue is that certain groups inevitably get left behind. And so, whether it's this issue, whether it's other issues, we have consistently seen this in the groups that we've advocate for, whether it's, policy dealing with any issue. So, we've talked about this at length, but, not taking a child rights lens to disaster recovery means inevitably that, vulnerable children are left behind. Not taking a gender lens, right? It means that women and girls are going to be left behind. Not taking an immigrant rights lens means that immigrants in that community are going to be left behind. And so whether we're looking at, natural disasters in Hawaii, in North Carolina, in Arkansas, wherever it is, it's really critical that we look at that jurisdiction, that community, who's going to be impacted, and make sure that we have the voices of that community represented. Otherwise, undoubtedly, there are going to be members of that community who are left behind. I mean, we talk about the reproductive issues here. We were talking about this in a meeting earlier that, there was just no consideration given to the pregnant and parenting mothers in Hawaii, and the fact that there was no formula, there was no midwives available, and that they were literally jet skiing these, baby formula to the islands to make it available for these moms. And so just not having that lens means that, these critical needs are going to be omitted for very vulnerable subsets of our community. Not having that child rights lens means that every time, we learned this in COVID, that when times get difficult, inevitably rates of child abuse go up, things get stressful for families, domestic violence goes up. And so needing to understand these considerations is incredibly crucial. And so irrespective of what community we're in, and what's really important about this report is that it's much bigger than Hawaii. It really is a blueprint for every single community, and really bigger than wildfires, I think. Because, these natural disasters are becoming much more frequent, much more deadly, and they're touching all of our communities. And I think this type of comprehensive lens is crucial to make sure that we have a built-in response that takes into consideration all of the needs of our very diverse communities, and, has a built-in response so that we're not caught off guard, that we're not, 2 years out. And as you said, a lot of these events are mass homelessness events. And we have, members of our community 2 years out that are still suffering and still, don't have basic needs. And it's not surprising to us who've been doing this work for many years that survival sex or trafficking and exploitation would be rife. But, and I think, the 1 in 16 number is incredibly low. I think that's probably, it's a very stigmatized issue. It's a very shameful issue. And I think especially in immigrant communities, even acknowledging or disclosing something like prostitution or sexual exploitation is very difficult. So I would wager that it's actually much higher than was disclosed in your report as a means of survival, just based on the work that we do. So again, thank you so much for your work. We're really grateful. And again, please share the report and the findings. And if any of your offices are interested in bringing forth a standalone bill, we are eager to work with you on that. So thank you all so much. We're grateful for you being here with us, and we'll be here to answer any other questions that you might have. Thank you, and get some food if you didn't already.